Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at Caesar's De Bello Gallico, Book 4, Chapter 30. So you remember at this point in the narrative we've been talking about the invasion of Britain in the greater scheme of the Gallic Wars, and we've seen that Caesar landed his expeditionary force, although that was a bit tricky. He's faced the storm, fighting his way through, his ships being wrecked, not having his cavalry, his supplies, all these different things, and he's finally gotten to a point in the last few chapters where he's made some peace with the British tribes. He's going to take hostages. And basically he's going to stay for a little bit in order to kind of keep everything under control and keep it peaceful. But the biggest fear that Caesar has is the winter coming, right? So he's trying to get out as soon as he can because he doesn't have anything prepared for the winter. Okay, so that's kind of where we pick up the narrative and we'll go from there. But before we dive in, like I always tell you in these videos, the thing you want to do whenever you're reading any Latin is do a quick pre-read, make a quick vocab list if you can, or find one from a commentary. It's really hard to understand what's going on if you just don't know what the words mean. That should always kind of be step one. The other thing you want to do is try to read this out loud. If you can find a classmate or anyone you can read this to, practice your speaking, your pronunciation. You don't just want to read this in your head. Bring it alive for the language that it is, right? And it'll also help you with understanding, particularly if you can have someone read the Latin back to you, right? That way you work on your listening skills and kind of work and activate that reading comprehension. Okay, so I'd always encourage you to do that. The other method that I always tell my students to use as they read is read and reread. Okay, so read through it once, write down any problem areas you might have. It could be grammar, it could be vocab, whatever it is. Then when you've read through this chapter completely, go back and look at your list. If it's vocab, that's easy enough. Just look up the words. You should be able to get them. If it's grammar, it might be a little bit trickier, but something like a commentary will help you out, or trying to just recognize, what's going on. Maybe you got a tense wrong or didn't recognize subjunctive, something like that. Try to fix all the problem areas and then go back and read it a second, a third, a fourth time, whatever it is. And at some point, you want to be able to read through this without needing any vocab help, having to look at a grammar, anything like that, and understand the narrative. That's how you know you're in a good place and you're ready to move on. It doesn't mean you're perfect. You might miss a word here or there, but in general, you should be able to do this pretty well without needing too much help. Okay, so if you've already done that, if you haven't done it, rather, pause the video, go back and do it, right? You don't want this to be your first time looking at this chapter. But if you have done that and you feel confident, let's move on. We'll go through it together. And as long as what you did is pretty close to what I did, again, not that mine is ever perfect, my translation, that is, you can feel pretty comfortable that you've got it and you're ready to move on. Okay, so chapter 30 starts like this, right? You have quibus rebus cognitis, principes Britanniae, qui post proelium ad Caesarem convenerant, inter se collucuti, rather, cum equites et naves et frumentum Romanis deesse intelligerant, ... Okay, so we're going to pause because there's a long sentence here that we're going to break up into pieces. Okay, so you start with this ablative absolute. You have quibus rebus cognitis, or cognitis, rather. So with these things known, right, or having been known. Then you have your subject, the principes Britanniae, right, the chiefs or kind of leaders of Britain, right? And again, with these things known, it's referring back to the previous chapter, okay? So you remember in chapter 29, that's where you get sort of the full moon and the wrecking of the ocean and all these things, and Caesar's fleet is destroyed. So this is kind of referencing back, saying that the leaders of Britain realized that, Caesar's in trouble. Okay, so the chiefs of Britain, who after the battle, convenerant, had come or convened to Caesar, right? They'd come to Caesar, right? After the battle. You have collucuti inter se, so speaking among themselves or between themselves. Intelligerant, they understood or kind of understood that when the cavalry and the ships and the frumentum, right? So the equites and the naves and the frumentum, they were lacking to the Romans or for the Romans, right? So in other words, they're recognizing or they're understanding now that Caesar doesn't have enough frumentum, corn or food, however you want to put it. He doesn't have the ships and he doesn't have the cavalry to actually attack them, if that makes sense. So these things are lacking to the Romans, right? Deesse Romanis. So they've recognized that his ships got wrecked and now they're going to kind of change their plan. All right, so that's where you have the inter se collucuti. It's got this idea of they're making sort of like a conspiracy among themselves. They're talking among themselves. That's kind of the idea, right? They're recognizing that there's a problem for the Romans. Okay, so what do? Well, it continues on. You have et paucitate militum et ex castrorum exiguitate cognoscerent, quae hoc erant etiam angustoria quod sine impedimentis Caesar legiones transportaverat, ... Okay, so not only do they have the ships not being there, the food, all these things. But there's also a paucitate militum, a scarcity or a lack of soldiers. And then not only that, they know that there's a lack of soldiers. So in other words, you can go to cognoscere, they discovered or realized the lack of soldiers, the scarcity of soldiers, because of the exiguitate, the smallness of the camp. So in other words, the British are looking at the Roman camp and saying Caesar doesn't have enough men because it's a tiny camp, or in their eyes, a small camp, or maybe even smaller than they thought he had, right? So that's kind of the whole idea. And Caesar's about to explain why. So the quae here is referring back to the camp, right? So the quae is really referring to castrorum. So it's the camp, right, or the smallest of the camp, which was even angustoria, was even more narrow, right, because of this or by this. So it's saying that the camp was even more sort of narrow than usual, is kind of one way to think about it, for these reasons, right? So in other words, he's saying it's smaller because then you have Caesar. He transportaverat. He had transported the legions, legiones, sine impedimentis, without baggage, right? Remember, they're not anticipating to actually stay a very long time. So there's no baggage. There's not a lot of soldiers. So on top of the fact that it's small, it's even more narrow, right? The etiam angustoria, because there's no baggage with them, right? Another indication that this wasn't planned as an invasion so much as an expedition, and they just don't have the normal stuff with them that would fill out a Roman camp. So we continue on to the next line. And you have, and again, this is just a continuation of the same thought. You have optimum factu esse duxerunt rebellione facta frumento comeatuque nostros prohibere et rem in hiemem producere. So you have this this indirect statement, basically, right, where Caesar's giving you thoughts and sort of conversations that aren't quoted here, but it starts with duxerunt, right? They considered here is probably the best way to do it. Usually we see it as led, but it does have that sort of idea of thinking also involved here in this way of translating it. So you could say they considered it optimum, best, right? So the essay there means that like it was, right, in your indirect statement. So you're saying they considered it was best to do. With the rebellione facta frumento, right? You have the ablative absolute here, with a rebellion having been made. So they're thinking that it was best to do something, right? And you have, the frumento, sorry, so from corn, this is probably the ablative of separation. So it's saying that they're going to prohibere, to prohibit nostros, our men, from corn, meaning from like food or supplies, frumento, and comeatu, and supplies. Okay, so they're going to prevent the Romans from foraging, is kind of the idea. So normally when you have no food, the Roman army would send out foraging parties, and the Britons are basically going to prevent them from succeeding, right? They're going to kill them if they find any of these parties, right? With the rebellion already started, okay? So they're going to prevent them from food and to draw out producere, right? To kind of literally means something like to lead off or to draw away, something like that. But I think draw out kind of gets the better idea here of what's going on. So you have draw out the rem, the situation, in hiemem, into the winter. So it's saying that they're going to draw out Caesar's stay in Britain until the winter comes. Remember, that's the problem for the Romans. If the winter shows up, there's a very good chance they're going to die because they don't have enough supplies, they don't have enough food, they're stuck, they don't have ships, right? So that's the idea that's happening here. This rebellion, as Caesar calls, right, this conspiracy, is that the best thing for them to do is just not to attack the Romans straight up, right? They've already done that and lost, right, in the beach landing, but instead they're just going to prevent them from getting supplies, right? And the idea is the Romans will eventually die out. Okay, then you finish it with this. You have quod eis superatis aut reditu interclusis neminem postea belli inferendi causa in Britanniam transitorum confidebant. So the reason for all this is because, okay, and then again you have that ablative absolute happening here as well, right? So it's saying because with these, meaning like these people, right? I guess is kind of the idea, right? So with them or with these overwhelmed, it's going with interclusis and superatis here, right? So with these overwhelmed or cut off, reditu, from return, right? So again, the British, Caesar's putting thoughts into the mind of the British chief. So the A's here is really referring to him, right? The Romans. So it's saying with these men, with these people, the Romans, overwhelmed, right? There's your first part, superatis, or interclusis, kind of cut off from reditu, from a return, right? Neminem postea, so nobody after the or afterward, right? Postea. And again, to really figure out what they're doing here, you go to the very end with confidebant, they believed, right? So if you put it all together, you're saying that they believe that with all these things having happened in the ablative absolute, right? Being cut off and overwhelmed, they believe that nobody, transitorum esse, right, is really what's going on there with transitorum, right? You're missing the essay to make it the future infinitive to kind of finish this indirect statement. So you're saying they believed that nobody would cross in Britanniam into Britain, causa, for the sake of belli inferendi, waging war, right? You have the gerundive there, for the sake of waging war. So the British logic is pretty sound, right? Their idea is, if we cut off the Romans here and destroy Caesar, nobody else is going to come attack Britain, right? The thing you have to remember is this is not a direct quote. It's Caesar telling us this. So is this actually what they believe? Yeah, it sounds about right, maybe, right? But we're not entirely sure because it's all indirectly reported, okay? And then you finish with this line. You have itaque russus coniuratione facta paulatum ex castris discedere et suos clam ex aguris deducere coiperant, rather. Okay, so coiperant, they began, right? So and again, you probably do the first part before we go that far. You're saying so so again, coniuratone facta, with a conspiracy having been made, right? And notice that word, the coniuratione there, right? We've seen that word before in Caesar, particularly when he's talking about the Helvetii, right? This secret conspiracy. So with the conspiracy having been made, meaning they already have their secret plan. Again, coiperant, they began to do a few things. The first thing they began to do, again, rorsos, is discedere, right? To depart ex castris, from the camp, paulatim, gradually, right? Little by little, they depart from the camp. And deducere, to lead suos, their own, meaning their own men or their own soldiers, in secret, clam, secretly, ex agris, from the fields, right? They begin leading their troops from the fields. So the idea is they leave their own castris, right? They depart from their camps, right? Very secretively, gradually, right? And they start pulling their men, their fighting men, back from the fields, right? Because they're getting ready to attack the Romans, or at least harass them. Okay, so that's chapter 30. It's not too bad, right? It's not a particularly long or difficult chapter, right? But it does give you some interesting narrative in terms of what's going on in Britain, right? So the British don't necessarily abide by the treaty, and it's interesting to think about a few things. So let's just take a look at the questions to think about here. You want to notice how Caesar portrays the Britons in this chapter, right? They break the treaty when they get the first chance. It kind of makes them feel a little sneaky, and Caesar's definitely placing blame on them and making them seem like they're forming a conspiracy, okay? But you want to think about why they agree to do this, right? If this actually is the reason, it's because they're looking at Caesar's army and they're saying he doesn't have enough troops and he has no way out of here. That goes to my second bullet point, right? You want to think about the logistics of this expedition. It's causing problems again, right? Caesar didn't bring the baggage or the supplies. He wasn't planning to be there until winter. He gets stuck, and now he doesn't have a very good contingency plan, right? So that threat of winter is once again leading to problems, because the British are able to basically call his bluff and say, like, you're not going to do anything. You can't, you're stuck. You don't have enough men. You don't have enough supplies, right? Because they can see his camp. And you want to notice the use of the word coniuratione and clam, right? Secretively, conspiracy, even paulatum, right? Little by little. These words are all kind of interesting and imply Caesar's view towards the tribes. They're kind of sneaky, right? They're not doing this in the open. They're secretly breaking the treaty. It also gives you a little view into what actually happened. Do you think Caesar anticipated this move? He's writing it as if he kind of knows that they're doing this, which I always found interesting, right? He's reporting that they're secretly doing this. He must have found that out afterwards, right? So you should wonder how he knew this was their plan, right? And I mentioned that in the bottom bullet point here. He's giving more thoughts of these British chiefs. How does he know this, right? How does he know what he's thinking? Or is he making it up? But one way or another, they are going to attack, and Caesar's pegging it to this, right? They notice that he's in trouble, and they attack. Could Caesar have anticipated this? I don't know. It's worth thinking about. Should he have known that he was in a weak position and the British weren't going to really, let this happen? Who's to say, right? But it is interesting to think about, should he have known this? And I asked the question here, why might he not have thought this would happen, right? Well, he just defeated them in battle, right? He probably wasn't expecting them to do this. And should he have seen another attack coming? It's an interesting way to think about it. he seems to have anticipated that something might go wrong, which is why he wants to leave. He's just not able to do it. So there's a lot of good kind of logistical questions here and strategic questions on how, again, how Caesar let this happen. But one way or another, we get another view as the British prepare to break that treaty and attack or at least harass the Romans. They're not going to directly engage them in battle, but they realize that the Romans are in a really tough spot, which Caesar acknowledges. Okay, so just some things to think about. If you had any questions at all about the translation or the section, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help. My translation is never a perfect one, so maybe you just translated a different way or had a disagreement, put it in the comments. Happy to help however I can. But otherwise, just keep at it, keep practicing it, right? Use read and reread, and at some point you want to be able to read this without needing any help. That's how you always know you're on the right track. Okay? Good luck with it.